This video is sponsored by World Anvil. On Monday, I made a video where I created 5 D&D characters using a random generator to create the prompts. But that video wasn't just a fun way to discuss one of my favorite random character generators for D&D, it was also a prologue for today's video. Because today we're going to talk about backstories in D&D, and how much information you should give to your game master, and maybe even what makes a good backstory. Now, my goal is not to give you a rubric and insist on reductive criteria like, a good backstory is 1.5 pages and provides the GM with 1 antagonist or 1 villainous NPC, establishes 2 NPCs you care deeply about, introduces 1 new and interesting location, and references 1 legendary magic item. Because if we were to do that, then we'd lose a lot of the variety and versatility that comes from unleashing your individual creativity. For example, many of the Vox Machina members do have an antagonist in their backstory. Not Keyleth. Many of them have an absent or dead father. Not Keyleth, though she does have a absent, probably dead mother. Grog's and Scanlan's backstories don't add any invented locations to the world. Pike's backstory simply references some sketchy cousins, but otherwise was tied into growing up with Grog as a foster brother. There doesn't need to be a backstory formula. And in fact, that's exactly the reason we're creating these backstories based on randomly generated characters. If I was making original characters or using my existing characters for this video, you'd notice some very strong similarities between them. I don't think we're quite at the point yet in the lifetime of this channel where you can tell who a Mike Christensen character is just by hearing their description, but trust me, give it a couple years and you'll see that I've got a type if you haven't figured it out already. But hopefully, because these characters were essentially created randomly, we should wind up with a broader spread of different types of backstories. But before we get into those examples, let's tackle the central question in a bit more detail. For real, how much backstory should you give your game master? Well, I once mentioned in another video that world building is for game masters as writing backstories is for players. It's something you can spend a lot of time doing, but often you're doing it because it's fun for you, and you hope it will be fun for others as well, but you can also fall into a wormhole of writing way too much and including details that nobody else is all that interested in. But there is a key difference here, because players are not on the hook to make their backstories interesting for an audience, whereas game masters are. I think this is where a lot of game masters get hung up, and this is something that I should talk about some more another day, but a lot of dungeon masters assume that the lore and features of their world will just be interesting for interesting's sake, when that's not actually true. These details need to be woven into the story dramatically in order for the players to care. On the flip side, and somewhat ironically, players do expect their backstories to be interesting for interesting's sake, because it actually isn't their job to take the backstory and integrate it into the story. It's the game masters. That said, it would be nice if the backstory was interesting or compelling, otherwise the GM isn't going to read it, and they're the one who actually has to read it. This is another reason why you should really not give your game master too much backstory. Actually, there are 2 reasons. The first is because if you give your game master a 5, 10, 15-page backstory, that's pretty overwhelming. But the second is, well, how much has actually happened to your character? After all, if you establish that you have an entire backstory as an adventurer, does that actually line up with the campaign your GM is running? We'll talk about the background charts in Xanathar's Guide to Everything another time, but one of the risks with using those charts, just as an example of this problem, is that you could wind up with a backstory where your character has been through a lot before the first session. I've also seen people come to the table with backstories that establish a history, fighting monsters or casting spells that their characters wouldn't actually be able to handle at low levels, which makes it hard for the player to understand the stakes of playing a level 1 or 2 character if their backstory makes them overly confident about what their character is capable of. Well, my character is a vampire hunter. It's in his backstory, so why should I worry about a couple of goblins? And then, live at the table, the GM has to tell them, no, your character only thought they were fighting vampires, they were just fighting a vampire spawn. Because they needed to keep a hand on the wheel to control the pace and narrative of the game. So my main piece of advice is, less is more. Try to find a balance between the minimum amount of information you need to establish who your character is and where they came from to get them to the point of being an adventurer, but with the maximum bang for buck in terms of plot hooks your GM can work with. Now, that doesn't mean that the player isn't still on the hook to make their backstory matter. The backstory needs to inform their role-playing, and honestly, that should probably be a whole other video, right? Probably should be. Feels like it should be. But the point is, not only do players expect their backstories to be interesting just for the sake of being interesting, but they also want the game master to weave it into the campaign and make it dramatically relevant to the events of the story. So, it is actually pretty different from world building in that sense. However, one thing that players and game masters both struggle with is how to present their information in an interesting and compelling way. And if you're a game master, or you're thinking about becoming a game master at some point in the future, I actually do have a solution for this problem. You can sign up for today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a convenient and robust toolset that you can use to build your campaign setting and keep track of the information. And then you can actually share compelling articles with your players thanks to their terrific templates. And if you're a game master collecting the backstories of your players, you can use the Chronicles feature to create timelines of the events that occurred in each player's backstory, as well as world events that will also matter to the campaign. And the fine folks at World Anvil are offering a discount. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you could save 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Okay, so we've talked a bit about what backstories should and maybe shouldn't do, so let's build some backstories. What do you say? The first backstory we're going to create is for Histix Bimblebomble, the Deep Gnome Tempest Cleric. Those of you who remember his origin might recall that he's a folk hero who helped free his fellow captives from a slave ship, but he also has some prejudices in how he views the world. Things like all drow and orcs are a certain way, sort of the same kinds of beliefs we saw repeated in the 2014 Monster Manual. So for this character, we already basically know the inciting incident. We know what made him who he is. We discussed this in the Twitch chat about when we were creating the character. Some of this is in the last video, but he was basically captured by Duergar, and then as a storm hit the ship, a god reached out to Histix, and he was able to use this connection to this god to free himself and the rest of his crew and liberate the ship. That's how he gained this reputation as basically a breaker of chains. Though that specific term is too close to Game of Thrones, I think it would be distracting for most of the people I played with. After spending some time on thesaurus.com, I think a better nickname for him would be the Untethered, which has a lot of great double meanings. Obviously, it means that he's free from his chains. Tether also means the limit of one's strength or resources, so to call him untethered implies there is no limit to his strength, which is certainly true. He's a cleric. They can get pretty powerful. But also there's the term untethered from reality. Calling him untethered kind of implies that Histix isn't rational, which we know is kind of true. We know he has a short temper and some incorrect views of the world, and specifically some of the people who live in it. So while some people call him untethered, it's both a compliment and an insult. Now, how did that god make contact? Well, I think, honestly, as the storm hit, Histix found himself praying for the first time. Or maybe he prayed and that's when the storm hit. And as he prayed again, his chains broke and he was able to call upon his new god to help him free the other captives and take over the ship. So who was he before? Well, when rolling for personality traits in the last video, we established that he doesn't know where his family is. Now, it could be easy to say that they were all enslaved, but I don't particularly want to make the entire family enslaved. Let's just say, that feels like I'm trying to recreate a very specific human experience that I personally don't have any interest into diving into. I feel like that story has already been told plenty of times and been told well, and I don't feel the need to roleplay through it. My next instinct was to say that perhaps this is someone who was a refugee, like maybe there was some sort of war and his family were simple people who were just displaced. But I don't love the implication that refugees fleeing war are the real racists, so then I thought, maybe this is someone who had a lot of money. In fact, I might even declare that they were a noble. But, and this is so important, I would insist to my GM that nobody outside of the Deep Gnome Society has ever heard of the Bimblebomble noble family. And what Histix didn't know is that his family had a terrible reputation inside their community. So even the non-noble gnomes would give him no love, even if they were locals. So while narratively he is a noble, he doesn't get the mechanical benefit of being able to evoke the position of privilege and meet with other nobles. He might often play the "don't you know who I am" card, but I would want my GM to never, ever reward me with the answer, "Yes, I do, and I'm going to treat you well because of it." Because this is a character who needs to be humbled. So since he's a member of a royal family, or a noble family, how exactly did it wind up captured by Duergar? Well, I actually think that he and his friend stole a family yacht for a pleasure cruise, and basically got captured by this group of Duergar who planned to sell him off at the next port. Actually, I think his friend got away. I don't want to kill off his friend. We don't really need to. It's more fun to leave the friend alive as somebody that Histix might run into again. So why doesn't Histix know where his family is? Well, because stealing the yacht was the first time that he had ever left the Deep Gnome's hidden caves. And because his entire life was meant to be lived in the noble house, and if he ever did leave, he would be accompanied by a retinue of attendants and retainers, well, he has no idea how to get back. He knows what cave he sailed out of. He knows what it looks like. He could find his way home if he can find the cave. The cave looks like a turtle's face. And ever since he took over the ship, he's taught himself to use cartographer's tools, since he has the proficiency with the tools, so he's very skilled at navigating. But deep gnomes are secretive, and the cave is well hidden in a grotto, so nobody he's asked about it has ever seen it. And so he does travel around trying to find rumors about his deep gnome civilization and where it might be located, but as he does so, he gets pulled into other conflicts, especially by people who have heard of him. And we talked about this on Monday, but this is important. He does like helping people. Now maybe he does it for praise, or maybe he does it so he can meet more people and gain more esteem so he can receive better treatment and perks, or even just so he can ask more people about the deep gnomes. But he does like helping people, otherwise he wouldn't go on D&D adventures, and that would be a problem. So all we would do here is put together a document and put this in chronological order, make sure to name his friends and his family because those are important NPCs, and maybe also name the Deep Gnome City. That's probably a pretty good idea. And of course, I would ask my GM who the God of Storms is in their campaign and take down some relevant information about that god. I'm not going to do that all in this video because we're going to have enough names flying around. I feel like giving you all the NPC names for all 5 of these characters and cities and this god would just muddy the waters and make it harder to follow the video. But beyond that, I think this is a pretty solid backstory. Our next character is Faeora, the half-elf warlock who grew up in the Dragon Caves and is the last bastard child of a king. She has apocalyptic visions, and we'll come back to that soon. She's half drow, and we discussed that her tribe is called the Wolf Spiders because they revere both wolves and spiders. I don't necessarily think that she came from a major drow city. This is just a tribe of drow that live in the Underdark, in the caves of a dragon. Now, I've been thinking this tribe serves a dragon who lives in these caves. Instead of kobolds or goblins, this dragon has drow servants. And we also know that Faeora is a genie warlock who found her genie patron in a bottle inside the dragon's hoard. So we've got 2 big questions. How did a king wind up conceiving her with a drow, and is this dragon still alive? Well, these questions are actually kind of linked, because whether this dragon is dead or not helps to determine what happened with the king. Here's what I'm thinking. The dragon is alive, purely because I think it's so much more interesting if she got enticed to steal a bottle from the hoard while the dragon is still alive, because then you have the dragon and the other wolf spiders potentially out to find her and, you know, maybe kill her with dragon breath for stealing from the hoard. So somebody came down here to slay this dragon once. If this dragon had been killed, then maybe this would have been a prince in his youth coming down here as an adventurer, making an alliance with the wolf spiders, or at least negotiating for them to let the adventurers pass without issues. And the night before the battle, he shared his tent with one of the locals, like a medieval Captain Kirk. And then he and his team slayed the dragon and left, not realizing they left a baby brewing behind them. And then as he went on, he would become king. And honestly, that idea is a lot of fun. Faeora could basically be returning to meet him for the first time, like Buddy the Elf. But aside from the fact that I don't subscribe to the idea that you need to meet your estranged or absentee father in order to become complete as a person, but also, in that scenario, the dragon is dead, and I think it's far more interesting to have Faeora dreading a dragon attack. So instead, this was a king later in life, leading a squad of his knights into battle with a legendary dragon who had been menacing the kingdom. After all, that's a whole trope as well, a king leading his people into war with a dragon. Except in this case, it went catastrophically wrong, and the king died. The drow woman he went to bed with the night before the battle, because that still happened, could have one of his signet rings still, which Faeora can use as proof to show her heritage. Of course, it's not nearly that simple. Just having the ring doesn't mean people will believe that she's a noble, which, once again, means that she doesn't get the benefit of the noble position of privilege from the background. But we also have the king's living heirs on the throne. They've been rulers for probably 20 or 30 years now, for however old Faeora is. I like 20 years for that. And honestly, I wouldn't establish anything about them, because it's not my place as the player to figure out who these people are when Faeora has never met them. That's up to the GM to figure that out. But I do still like that this backstory gives us an obvious conclusion for some other potential antagonists in the form of the king's human heirs, if the GM decides to go that way. Now, we also have some apocalyptic dreams. So what I did was I went to the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I rolled on what might be my favorite chart in the book, the Campaign Shaking Events. I rolled a 10, which gives me Myth and Legend. Okay, that's cool and appropriate, but also kind of a bit vague and kind of already what I was going to go with. So to choose what type of legendary event Faeora is having dreams about, I rolled an 8. I got Fall of a Leader or Era, which could be awesome. Maybe Faeora is foreseeing the fall of a kingdom and going to try to stop it. But there's also the risk that she's going to cause it. She has no idea. But just for flavor, I'm going to roll another d8 to determine what the dreams say will happen if the kingdom's ruler falls. And we got Magic Gone Awry or a Planar Warp. Maybe in her dreams, she sees evocative imagery like a crown rusting and crumbling or cracking in half, and then she sees a mighty city, someplace kind of like Minas Tirith from Lord of the Rings, and then the sky over the city bursts into flames, and beyond the flames, she sees floating islands with other cities on them, as if other legendary cities have been pulled into this realm. Is this hell, or one of the other lower planes? Is this the elemental plane of fire? The plane of chaos? She has no idea, and neither do I as the player. I also think these dreams are what led her to stealing the bottle. She believes the genie can help her stop this from happening. And the fact that the bottle appeared just as she saw it in her dreams does help confirm to her that these dreams are predicting something, that they're going to come true, even if they won't play out precisely how she imagines they will. But there's also ambiguity there. Was the dream telling her that the genie can help, or that all of this will happen if she works with the genie? It is an Ifrit, so if her dreams are about a city being pulled into the elemental plane of fire, is the genie from the elemental plane of fire going to help prevent that, or is this just playing into his hands? So it's a pretty cool backstory with a great hook. We just would need to name her mother and her father, name the genie, and come up with the dragon's name and maybe what type of dragon they are. Next, let's turn our attention to Conrick Heartdancer, the greedy halfling merchant who collects swords and wound up purchasing a hexblade sword. To be completely honest, that already sounds like most of the backstory. We've pretty much got it all figured out. But there's at least one important detail to figure out. See, Conrick's bond is that they will to get revenge on the evil forces that destroyed his place of business and ruined his livelihood. That just makes me think of the opening of Treasure Island, or if you prefer, Treasure Planet. Our hero has gotten his hands on some sort of important MacGuffin, in this case the Hexblade, and some unscrupulous characters came to his shop to try to get it from him. Things turned violent, and Conrick found himself channeling the magic of the sword without expecting to, and that element of surprise was just enough for him to repel the attackers. But they still burned down his shop, and he was forced to flee. Now he wants answers about what's going on with this sword, but he also wants to find the people who burned down his shop and murder them. Now, I can't control anything to do with getting answers. All of that is in the GM's hands. But I can come up with some enemies who are looking for the sword. Let's describe the leader as a rough customer, someone who does have those sort of Long John Silver sort of vibes. We're not going to give him a peg leg, because we don't really need to evoke that sort of ableism, but he should feel unique. He should look unique. Maybe he looks like Marv from Sin City. That's an intimidating and distinctive figure, and also invites the GM to do a character voice that's not that tough to do. Honestly, just about everyone can do some version of a gruff voice, even if it's just a whisper. And he's got a crew with him. We'll say he's got a handsome tiefling with a golden rapier, a blue dragonborn who waved a wand and cast spells during the fight, and a dwarven woman wearing black leather and spikes and dark makeup and wielding some sort of holy amulet, or maybe an unholy amulet. Because why can't dwarves be sexy evil clerics? The goal here is just to give the GM some fun antagonists to play with and some wiggle room to do whatever they want with them. Maybe they're part of a solo act, or maybe they're part of a huge faction. I literally have no idea. I think I should come up with some names for them, though. Honestly, you don't have to, but it might be a lot easier on your GM if you do so. I'm thinking back to Percy from Critical Role, because there are a few people in Whitestone who he hadn't met before that horrible night, but that he still learned their names because that makes sense. Sometimes the bad guys talk to each other. But also it meant that once Matt started introducing these characters into the narrative, Taliesin didn't have to keep asking, wait, which one is Stonefell? Because he knew. So yeah, I would name all of these thugs and come up with a cool description for the Hexblade sword, but other than that, Conrick's backstory is done. Our fourth character is a tiefling wizard from a fallen noble clan who is on a path to prove that he can make it on his own so he can win the approval of his family. Oh, also, he's a recovering cannibal. Gonna reference that a few times in this segment, so if that's a topic that you're not comfortable with, feel free to skip this one. The time codes are on screen and in the description below. Okay, so ever since 4th edition, I've loved the idea that some tieflings used to be the nobility from a long-fallen empire. Specifically, I've got some villains that I think would be super cool for a future campaign because they could be running around out there trying to rebuild the tiefling empire. It's a cool motivation. And so some of that is going to be present in this situation. Sterling is one of the children of a noble family that, ever since the kingdom collapsed decades ago, they have been forced to live in their summer mansion year-round. Can you imagine the indignity? I actually think that they may have been humans back in the day, but over the years of the sort of horrible vices and indulgences that come from being rich and noble, they made deals with devils and wound up corrupting themselves. And one of those vices is that they eat human flesh. It's a delicacy in their house, even now to this day, even though they're out of power. Sterling himself has never gone out and hunted a human being before, and now that he's on his own, he knows better than to do that in front of other people. He's not even a chef. He wouldn't even know how to prepare the food. So he's now comparing all the food he eats in roadside taverns to the food of a household that is specifically trying to eat the fanciest food they can to prove to themselves that they were still important political people who could afford to, eat poached basilisk eggs and eat grilled coatl and eat, people. Now, let's be super clear. He didn't leave because he realized cannibalism was wrong. Although, to be even clearer, cannibalism is wrong. I probably didn't need to say that, but don't do a cannibalism. But Sterling isn't partaking in cannibalism only because he knows the small folk, the ordinary everyday people he meets out in the world, would not look at him fondly if they knew that his family eats people. It's a secret about his family that he can't share with anybody, or else it could damage their political standing. Because as much as they might hate it, the world has left their way of life behind, at least for now. Sterling actually does have the noble background, so people have heard of him, or at least they've heard of his family. It's just that nobody knows that one of the many ways that the family celebrates their wealth and status is by, But If that wasn't why Sterling set out to become an adventurer, then why did he? Well, because his family thought that he would never amount to anything. They thought so little of him that he ultimately felt, well, I have to do something about this. I have to make a name for myself. Maybe he got his hands on a spell book, one of the items that the family's culinary procurement team got from one of the family's victims. Sterling studied the spellbook and learned magic, and then decided that he knew enough that he could strike out on his own. Now, he still enjoys the finer debaucheries of life in just about every other form they take, in the more mundane ways they're offered in the wider world. So what exactly does he want? Well, I'm honestly not sure that he knows. I think some part of him expected his family to call his bluff by now. But the longer they go without recalling him home, sending out riders to find him, the more he has to continue to try to do outrageous things so word will spread of his remarkable deeds. Now he's found himself on the road to becoming an adventurer, more or less out of spite. Honestly, therapy probably would have been cheaper. So we would just need to come up with some names for family members and the family name itself, and then I think that's a backstory. Finally, let's create the backstory of Sir Marcellus Medina, the half-orc knight working to reclaim his titles that were stripped and stolen from him. If you remember the video from Monday, you know that none of that is true. He's actually a con man named Lionel Dugray. In truth, he just needs money. He conned a local lord, whose name we would probably need to come up with, before we gave this backstory to our GM, and now that lord is out for our hero's head. I almost said that they're out for Lionel's head, or out for Sir Medina's head, but no, the lord doesn't know either of those names, which means we would need to come up with yet another alias Medina/Lionel has used. But Lionel's whole goal is to find enough money to perhaps pay off his debts. It's why he steals everything he can get his hands on. But he's also a capable fighter, so when the occasion calls for it, aka when the reward is high enough, he'll go and fight monsters. And that's what he's been doing when we meet him in the campaign. He's taking bounties on monsters and continuing to live life as a new knight, Sir Marcellus Medina, and he's continuing his con to try to get any other local lord to favor him with some gold. You know, so he can pay off the last local lord he conned out of some gold. Surely this plan cannot backfire in exactly the way you're imagining it will. Now, I could also add something like that Lionel barely knew his father and was raised by an aunt who wouldn't tell him anything about his parents, but also I don't think we need that. Like, I would sit down with my GM and say, okay, if you want, I can give you info about where he comes from, but please hear me when I say this. I don't want him to find out that he was secretly important before he was ever born. He's not really a noble. He's not born to any special bloodline. The fun of this character, for me, is that he truly has no destiny laid out before him, and nobody waiting in the wings to embrace him and tell him that he's always secretly been important. He's not Luke Skywalker, whose father was an awesome Jedi Knight, and also the Dark Lord of the Sith, who was prophesied to save and or destroy the galaxy. He's more like Han Solo, just a grifter who finds himself thrown together with a bunch of awesome people, and he's got to figure out how he factors into that. In other words, please don't pull a Rise of Skywalker and reveal that the character who came from nothing actually secretly had a super awesome and important origin story, because I think this character works way better if he's just some guy. Because honestly, if you want to have a specific experience with your character, just ask the GM about it. I didn't give my GM a script or any beats that they would need to hit. I just told them what I didn't want them to do with my character. That still leaves a lot of other options for the GM. Communication is just so important. I know I say it in like every video, but it really makes everything go so much smoother. So that's it. Those are the 5 backstories. I would type them up and format them so they're a little bit easier to read. And so I did. Those backstories are all free to access on my Patreon. The links are in the doobly-doo below. You don't even have to be a member. They are completely free. There is no right way to format the info you give your GM. There's no right length for the document, but attached is what I would give to my GM if I was playing one of these characters in a home game. Maybe there's some lessons here about how you could format your own backstories when you present them to your GMs. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments, and maybe that will be the topic of a future video. We'll have to see. And don't forget to come back here on Monday for my video about what I would do as the GM if I were given these documents by my players. We're going to see how we can integrate each backstory into a campaign, expanding them out into story arcs to give everybody their time in the spotlight. If you enjoy games like Critical Role, where each character's backstory gets a lot of time to shine, and you want to do the same thing in your own home games, then be sure to watch Monday's video. And like and subscribe and ring the bell so you can see each new video I post. Support me on Patreon to help me pay the bills, join my Discord server to be part of an awesome community of people, and follow me on Twitch to catch my live streams. Make sure to check out my first video in this series where I created these characters if you haven't watched that one already. Until next time, play fair and have fun.